Plans. That's the most basic idea. That sounds so dumb. Why am I saying that after 40 years? Don't I have anything more intelligent to say? And the thing is that the way that our social systems work is not to think and then solve these things. And that's very interesting. Our economic system is designed around a different principle, which is let people do what they want, get rich, go find your job, go buy what you want, but not solve problems. So in economic land, it's not oriented towards solving problems. It's oriented towards doing your thing. Businesses are supposed to go make profits, and we're supposed to be good consumers, and we're supposed to be smart in the job that we pursue. But at least in market economics, which became the dominant ideology of the Anglo-Saxon world and then the world, it isn't to solve problems, it's go do your thing. So don't expect the answers to these problems to come from the economic sphere or from the business community. It's not their job. Their job is to run a business, it's to make money. So that's problem number one, that we don't think in the economic sphere about end goals. We're supposed to just do our thing. And then politicians. In most politics, it's not about solving problems. It's about maintaining power. And that's even the goal. And you have experts on maintaining power. All the politicians have little Machiavellis around them, handing them, this is what you need to do to stay in power. And that's your goal. And so politics, at least in my country, has very little to do with any goals. I don't know what any American goals are. We have no goals. We have some heroes, our founding fathers. We love the Constitution. We like the July 4th Independence Day. But we have no goals. And even when I hear Dr. Zhao talk about China's goals, you could not have that in the United States, stating those goals. Because that's socialism. You're not allowed to have goals. So politics is not oriented towards solving problems, really. It's management of power, competition for power, holding on to power, benefiting from power. And so we don't see from our governments most of the time these big goals and how to solve them. I really think China's been different in this period, the last 40 years, from most other governments. And I think the success is a result of that, actually, that it's really, and why? Well, I think this is a very interesting question, but a few countries at a few times have very clear goals. Maybe because of survival, maybe because of their past history, maybe because they have a successful neighbor, so they want to imitate the success. Maybe, like in Singapore, because a genius came, Lee Kuan Yew, and he had a very, very clear idea. And really, Singapore, it is a case of a very clear, brilliant thinker who just guided things for quite a while, like Plato's philosopher king. But most of the time, this is not how politics is. So we don't see a lot of this problem solving coming from governments. And the third thing is, in my country, which became the most powerful country in the world for the last 75 years militarily, they really think that fighting wars is a big part of what governance is about. They're crazy and dangerous and could get us all killed. So that third category of just peaceful cooperation does not come easily. Every day we read something hateful about China in the American newspapers now. Every single day. I just read today, China has the Global Civilizations Initiative. Wonderful. You talked about it. Today I just read, this is terrible. This is, China's out to take over the world through this. Now, honestly, this is a mindset that is very, very deep, probably ingrained evolutionarily in us also, because there probably was a time when whoever could control the next water hole survived, and whoever didn't survive, and it was us or them. And that's not how the world is right now. It's not us or them. We don't need to take over any other place to have well-being, period. There's no crisis of living room. There is only the crisis of understanding, don't kill the other side. Okay, so what do we do? Again, just to conclude, we need to think clearly. Excuse me. That's a technical term about American politics. So we need really to put serious ideas forward in detail. And that's the purpose of what we're after. And two specific pathways that we're really focusing on right now is one is the energy transition, because there's only a quarter century and an energy system's really complicated. You have to have a power grid. We have to convert all the vehicles to electric or to hydrogen or to some other non-emitting source. The building sector has to be far more efficient. Industry emits a lot of greenhouse gases. Deforestation. In other words, all of the getting to net zero is quite a complicated challenge with lots of moving parts, and it's a lot of money. Not more than an energy system costs, but an energy system is trillions of dollars a year, and so it's worth getting right. So that's the first of the pathways. And the second is the land use and ocean use, because we're really so close to destroying everything irreversibly. When the species is lost, it's never coming back. And when the ecosystems are degraded, many of them never return. And if we pass climate thresholds, we're just going to spend the next century in disaster of calamitous sea level rises, storms, heat waves, and so on. So we're very close to that. So those are the two main pathways that we are really focusing on. The biological and its association with food production and with other agricultural production. And for this region, that's central, because this is a biodiversity Garden of Eden, and also a biodiversity threatened region intensively. All this beauty, and it's being torn down. And it can happen so fast because economies are very, very large right now, and demands. China could deforest this country just by its demands for tropical hardwoods without a problem, unless you take care. So those are the two areas that we really want to focus on. And the final point that I want to say is, again, about this third category of cooperation. it happens that when you look technically at an energy program or at a ecosystem program, no country can do this by itself. Nothing can be done other than at the local level, but plans need to be transnational without question. So there's a lot of local action, but they have to be part of a broader framework. And that's why this is an ASEAN workshop, because ASEAN countries are not only together on the map and not only physical neighbors, but have work to do together, because ASEAN countries cannot achieve their goals without working together. And so we need to do this at a transnational planning level. That's hard because there are no elected transnational officials anywhere. All transnational organizations are weak because none of them has an army. None of them has political leaders. We're organized at the national level in the world. That's where the physical force lies. And that's where the politics generally lies. And yet we have global and regional problems that need addressing urgently. The Mekong is not going to be saved one country at a time. It's going to be saved by China, Laos, PDR, Cambodia, Vietnam working together. Without question, there's no way to do that one country at a time. It's got to be done in the watershed. The energy system for Malaysia absolutely needs to be integrated with the rest of the region. And those regional institutions are weak politically and organizationally, and they need to be strengthened considerably. And then the question of what region is the right region for this. We're dealing with ASEAN because it's a crucial, established regional entity. But I said yesterday, and I'll say it again, I think for the energy sector, RCEP is even more appropriate. That's adding in ASEAN plus China, Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. The United States would have a fit, by the way. I'll be done in 1 minute. The US would have a fit. You're cooperating with China? Well, my strong advice to you is cooperate with China closely. And my strong advice to Australia is don't build a submarine base, cooperate with China. And let's not waste money on nuclear submarines right now and raise the tension more. So my own advice is that broader group, and I hope India joins that group, and then we've got a lot of the world together in a way that could actually solve the problems. So sorry for the long rambling, except I believe that all of these problems are solvable. I believe that universities have a unique and extremely important role to play in this, because this is what we should be doing. Training, teaching, educating, researching, policy analysis, and really trying to make politics work the way that it should, which is for the common good. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will start with the questions, if I may, right away. You have experienced a lot. You are one of the most famous scholars in the world, and you have witnessed many serious events, being the war in Vietnam, the collapse of the Soviet Union, invasion of the United States and its allies in Iraq, Afghanistan. However, today, often we hear that the situation at the moment is actually the most serious as it was, the most threatening as it was after the Second World War. Do you share this opinion?
We certainly have really grave dangers. We also have good solutions to these if we keep our head on and if we're honest about the situation. Of course, there have been moments of absolutely immediate peril. I think back 61 years, and I remember it actually, the Cuban Missile Crisis, when we were just within a moment of nuclear war. And it was only extraordinarily wise leadership by President Kennedy and by Nikita Khrushchev that pulled the two countries back from the brink of complete disaster for the world. We're not standing at the edge exactly that way, but boy, are we creating risks like the war in Ukraine, which is really a war between the United States and Russia. Though it's being fought in Ukraine by Ukrainians, it's a proxy war. And now this war in Gaza, which is a war fought by Israel, but made possible by the United States and is extremely dangerous. And the high tensions between the United States and China, which, again, I blame the United States for as the main reason. Add those up, it's a bad situation. But then add on top of that the fact that we have the man-made dangers of environmental destruction, climate change, pollution, destruction of our fisheries and our forests, that is very serious, very far along, and even denied by many political leaders. We still have political leaders who are scientifically ignorant, who aggressively deny what is absolutely facing us, which is terrible destabilization of the physical systems for our food supplies, our forests, our fisheries, and so forth. So you add this all up, it's a terribly difficult and bad time. And maybe what makes everyone so nervous on top of it is that the quality of political leadership is extremely low. Our president is 81 years old and should be in retirement. This is absolutely obvious. Our Congress is quite corrupt in the United States because we have a system of campaign financing that depends on billions and billions of dollars going from big companies to the congressmen and senators. And the U.S. isn't alone in this. There's a great deal of instability, and our political leaders don't know how to get along with each other. So you add this all up, it's definitely bad. Whether it's absolutely the worst, it's a little hard to judge, but it's bad enough that we ought to do something about it.
You actually mentioned many questions that I was going to ask, but if I understand correctly, how did we get there actually? So definitely there is some kind of crisis of leadership, because I believe that the problem is not only a senior American president, these problems can be also in other countries. Then, of course, there's a concentration of unprecedented crises. And of course, there is a part, I would say, that's considering the decisions that the superpowers make. Would you agree with this combination?
I think if I could put one word on the reason we're in this crisis, it is arrogance. Arrogance of the rich and the powerful. And the United States was the richest and the most powerful of all during this period. So the arrogance of the United States has been extremely notable. You know, when the Cold War ended in 1989 in Central Europe, and in 1991 in the former Soviet Union, we might have said, now we have a glorious opportunity for peace, for cooperation, and for prosperity. This didn't happen. It could have happened. I was there. I saw what could have been done. Instead, the United States said, we won, we're the best, we're the most powerful, we don't have to deal with anybody except on our own terms. And the United States absolutely went from arrogant to hyper arrogant and said, we can do what we want, where we want. And strangely enough, though the United States basically faced no security threats after that time, it went to war more often than ever. Of course, it completely misjudged two things. One, it continued to think of Russia as a natural enemy, and so it actually created a new enemy, because I was advisor to Gorbachev, I was advisor to Yeltsin. They wanted absolute peace and normal relations. There's no doubt in my mind. This wasn't a trick. It wasn't a plot. It was an attempt to create normal relations. The United States instead said, oh, no, we won. We won. Now we'll move NATO. Okay, Hungary, Czech Republic, Poland. Oh, we'll keep moving. We'll go to the Baltics. We'll go to Romania, Bulgaria. We'll go to the Balkans. Oh, no. We'll go to Ukraine. We'll go to Georgia. We'll surround Russia. We'll decolonize Russia. That's a term used in American political circles. Even saying, oh, Russia should be dismembered now. Well, what on earth are these people thinking? Russia has 6,000 nuclear warheads, a powerful army, a self-respect, and a desire for its own security. And so the United States provoked what absolutely it should not have provoked. So this was a part of the issue. A second part of the issue is that, in general, the rich became arrogant in a different way, saying, oh, we're so good. We used to be millionaires. Now we're billionaires. We don't have to share anything. So they became libertarian in philosophy. Libertarian in American philosophy means we don't have to pay taxes because what we have is ours and nobody's going to take it away. And so we developed a super rich class that became very self-righteous. That's my money. It's nobody else's money. How dare the government think to take it? And at the same time, a growing amount of people struggling in poverty or losing jobs to technology, being replaced by robots, being replaced by automation. So the gap in our society between the rich and the poor widened considerably. And this was the second factor. And you would think that in a political democracy, the poor people would vote out the ones that are leaning on them, or would vote for tax increases on the small group of very powerful. But that theory is wrong, because the small group of very powerful buy the politicians. They really do. And so they pay the campaign contributions. And the first rule of the US Congress is vote tax cuts for companies and rich individuals. So that is the second thing that happened. The third thing that happened is that the environmental crises, especially the climate change crisis, came and would require changes in our behavior and would also cause limitations to the big energy industry, the oil, the gas, the coal industry. And the industry resisted those changes, said no. And the politicians said, oh, it's not even real. Like Václav Klaus and others, they just denied the climate change. And this denial has gone on for decades. Actually, we just saw a new president of Argentina elected just now, who said that climate change is a socialist plot. You can't even make this up. I don't know whether this is just playing games to get elected, whether it's complete sheer ignorance, whether it's corruption. I don't know what it is, but it's shocking. People in any kind of responsibility should know better. They should at least understand what this issue is about. And this has been a very big challenge. It's, again, part of the arrogance. I happen to lead a scientific institute at Columbia University with hundreds of climate scientists. So I had an earful all the time about the climate science. Many people don't have that chance to hear directly. So they hear from politicians or actors who want to be politicians, who say whatever they feel like. And the result is that we go decade after decade without solving these problems, despite all the meetings, the treaties, the conferences, and so forth. So when you add all of this up, as I said, I think the underlying problem is arrogance of the rich and the powerful, who somehow think the rules don't apply to them. And we end up in a world that is in conflict. We end up in a world that is divided between rich and poor. We end up in a world that is facing massive environmental crises. And it's all so weird because the world's richer than ever before, better technologies than ever before. And we could, if we chose right, move to peace immediately. I just testified in the UN Security Council about 4 wars: the war in Ukraine, the war in Israel and Palestine, the war in Syria, and the war in the Sahel of Africa, which is Burkina, Mali, Chad, Niger. And I pointed out all 4 of these huge wars could be stopped tomorrow with politics, with basic sound politics. But our leaders are just incapable of basic sound politics, unfortunately.
When you mentioned arrogance and the beginning of the 90s, well, I am from the Czech Republic, as you know, myself. So,
of course.
Yes, we have vast experience with neoliberal policies and their application. However, I wanted to ask about liberal democracy. Of course, we have to mention Francis Fukuyama and his end of history. And now we see how completely wrong that was. But do you see also the liberal democracy as something that maybe hides more the true state of affairs than actually helps to resolve the conflicts? Because, when scholars like Martin Wolf suggest that maybe instead of voting, we should have some, choice by chance randomly, that would be better than elect the representatives that we have. There's certainly something wrong. So maybe if you could elaborate on the liberal democracy, and maybe it really will be an end, but the question is what kind of end it will be.
It would be great if we could make democracy work, because democracy is very attractive in principle. It's a way for free people to express themselves. It's a way for people to participate. It's a way for people to learn about social and political realities. So it, in principle, is a very attractive system. And in general, it's a way for people to have protection from their own governments, because non-democratic governments can be very, very destructive of their own people because there's no control necessarily over government. So in principle, I'm a Democrat, but in practice, you can see all of the difficulties of making this work. A democracy needs to have an informed public. A democracy needs to have a respectful dialogue or deliberation in the public, not shouting, not even worse, violence, not hidden influence. A democracy needs to prevent being taken over by powerful interests that use the democracy as a facade, as a pretense rather than real democracy. So some democracies work pretty well. Some in Europe work reasonably well. I would say the quality of the American democracy has declined tremendously during my lifetime. Maybe that's an illusion, but I feel that, and I can see even in the data that people had more confidence in government 60 years ago than they have today. And I look at that, and I've, of course, spent my whole life trying to understand that declining confidence in our government. And I find two factors that are at the core of this. One is that after World War II, the United States created a security state with the CIA and other institutions that were supposedly ensuring national security. But in fact, they really diminished democracy, because the first principle of the CIA is that it's secret and its actions are secret. And it does lots of things around the world that are not good, but they're secret. So this really undermined American democracy. And we don't have much public effect on foreign policy, for example, in the United States, because when it comes to foreign policy, really the president and a few other people make decisions on behalf of everybody without public debate or without control by any really democratic institutions, other than a vote once every few years. But that's not enough, because we go to war all the time against the interests of the American people. So that's one part of the problem. The other part of the problem that I mentioned earlier is the big money in politics. Some countries restrict private campaign financing. In fact, most in Europe don't have a lot of corruption of the political system. But the United States, I regard as kind of legal corruption, legal in the sense that our Supreme Court said that companies can spend whatever they want on politics, no restriction, or few restrictions. And the result is our election cycle, say the 2024 election, will spend maybe $15 billion of campaign financing. Now, you don't get honest government with so much money changing hands. You get government that is purchased by the highest bidder. And this is why the confidence in democracy has declined so much.
You mentioned, of course, the power of big money. I wouldn't be so optimistic about the situation in Europe. I just believe because the economies are weaker, then there's not so much money as in the US, but the tendency is practically the same. You mentioned Joe Biden and, of course, then President Trump. Probably they'll meet in elections next year, probably. Do you see the crisis in leadership? Because when we look in the past, we see many strong leaders who were both from Europe, from the United States, who were able to offer some vision and lead a society, some of them even towards a peaceful society. We mentioned Willy Brandt, Olof Palme. We can also mention Ronald Reagan as a special type of American heritage as well. I would say there is a certain decline in these leadership qualities. Do you view it as well? Because in Europe, it's, I think, very visible.
Yes, I think the quality of the political leadership in the US and Europe is very weak right now in general. speaking of the United States, we have two leading candidates, one of whom is 81 and can't find his way off the stage anymore. He happens to be our president. And the other one is a convicted, is multiply convicted, psychologically unstable person who now faces dozens of criminal counts right now in trials coming up. So maybe we'll have an octogenarian who should never be running, and a convicted felon running for the presidency. This is a terrible, terrible thing, obviously. How can we get there? There are some other candidates. I'm hoping that Robert Kennedy Jr. Proves himself as a highly capable candidate, and I like him. We were schoolmates, we're friends, and he comes from a great political tradition. In fact, his uncle, John F. Kennedy, was, in my view, the last great American president, because after that, well, we had some very nice and smart people, a few, not very many. Jimmy Carter was one. But we've had a lot of failed presidents and failed presidencies. So the quality of leadership is quite low. And in Europe, it's also really surprising to me how, when the United States makes such bad judgments, European leaders tend to follow along the US lead. And of course, I'm very unhappy about the Ukraine war. I mean, everyone's unhappy about it, but I have a view that's somewhat different from the mainstream view, which is, in my interpretation, the war in Ukraine was caused by the US wanting to expand NATO. And of course, many in Europe say, no, it's all Putin. He did this. But I know enough history, and I was present at enough events to know how much the US provoked this war through absolutely stupid policies. Because if you're smart, you don't push a military alliance right up against Russia's border. That's just not a wise thing to do. Russia's extremely sensitive to the military of the West encroaching on it, because of how many times Russia's been invaded by the West. And especially when the United States politicians have so much hostility to Russia, which they do. They openly express the idea that Russia should be dismantled and many other things. Of course, Russia's going to see NATO expansion as a direct threat to national security, and it's not going to let it happen. So this is just an example of terrible policy, predictable disaster. But the US went along with it. Now, my point was, the Europeans knew better. I know, because many Europeans told me many times, oh, NATO expansion to Ukraine is very dangerous. But then they don't say it in public. And they don't say it in public because the United States would get mad at them. And, they're afraid of the US. They shouldn't be afraid of the US. Europe should have its own independent foreign policy, and it should understand its own interests. And the interests are not just following along the United States. So this is just a very important example of the weakness of the political leadership right now in Europe as well as in the United States.
Yeah, we see that here very well. So they're actually not able even to formulate the national interests. And I don't know if it's fear or simply they are not capable to understand what's going on. Maybe it's a combination of both. However, the consequences are really disastrous for the EU, both economically and politically, of course. You mentioned
one European political leader said to me a couple of years ago, oh, they don't take us seriously in Washington. And he said it even more colorfully, which I won't repeat exactly, but this was a leader of a major country. And my thought was, yeah, but you should not allow yourself to be treated that way. That's your fault. That's not America's fault. Yes, America's arrogant, but stand up for Europe. And this should be the approach, but it's not the approach. Rate of 40 or 50% per year. And Argentina had a large debt. But actually, not. I shouldn't even say that. It had a relatively small debt, but since nobody trusts Argentina, no one would lend it new money. So as the old debt was coming due, a government would normally borrow new money to pay off the old money and keep the debt level pretty much the same. But Argentina has no friends, nobody trusts it. So as the Argentine debt was coming due, everyone wanted to be repaid. Thank you, no more loans. So I was trying to help, since part of my work over the last 40 years has been in economic emergencies, and I helped them negotiate arrangements with their bank creditors, and I helped them negotiate arrangements with the International Monetary Fund. And I said, oh God, this is tough. Nobody believes in Argentina, least of all the Argentines. So after these agreements were reached, I flew to Buenos Aires and I met in a large room with Argentina's PUBAs, the powers and shakers. And I said, you know, your situation is not as bad as you think. Your debt is actually not so high. Your need for the central bank to print money is actually not so high. It's just that nobody trusts you. So if we could regain trust, believe me, you know, your balance sheet is actually better than the US government. It's just that in the US, everybody uses the dollar, so you can run big budget deficits. But Argentina's budget deficit was smaller than the US, and Argentina's inflation soared because everyone was always ready to run out of the peso. Okay, so I said, just rebuild trust. I felt pretty good. Compelling speech, showed the data, showed that the US is worse at a fundamental level than Argentina. Flew home, and within days, the finance minister basically resigned because his own political party more or less disowned him after he had gotten these agreements. Oh my God, okay, he's gone. Inflation soars again. And so all that handiwork of saying, you know, there's a way to get out of this, be careful, evaporated, and the inflation eventually rose to more than 100% per year, which is pretty high, although I've dealt with countries in thousands of percent per year. But it was sufficiently high that the Argentines said in this election, we don't want to hear anything about any standard politician. We want something completely new. And the incoming president promised something completely new, specifically to adopt the dollar. And it's probably not going to happen because quickly they backtrack. We don't even have dollars. We can't tie our future to a currency in which we have no reserves. We couldn't back the banking system and so forth. I've not spoken with the new government, although I know the incoming finance minister quite well. I plan to speak with them. The long and the short of it is, this is just chronic crisis. So I wouldn't draw too much about general facts from Argentina, because basically almost any time between 1823 and 2023, you could have found the country in crisis. And I've dealt with already in my career with a number of presidents of Argentina. And they don't have the internal political capacity to overcome this yet. So all of this is to say, Argentina, endlessly fascinating, a little bit bizarre. Hopefully they'll get out of it this time. What's interesting now geopolitically is that the outgoing government had joined the BRICS, and that is a good thing. and an important thing for Argentina because it brings Argentina and the next door giant Brazil together, which is very good for South America, very important diplomatically, very important geopolitically. The incoming government has said, oh, we don't want to have anything to do with China because Milei is being portrayed as an ardent Americanist, so on the American side of this bloc politics. My message to the Argentines is, look, China's your major customer. Don't be dumb. Don't go with the U.S. in this sense. Trade with the U.S., trade with China. Don't get into this crazy mentality of one side or another. And by the way, in this world today, if you have to choose one side or another, I wouldn't go with the American side. Every time a country sides with the United States these days, it ends up in disaster, like Ukraine, because the U.S. is a fading empire. It can't sustain all its promises, not even close. It can't even keep its own public institutions functioning anymore. So my message to the Argentines is you don't have to choose sides. Just be nice, but don't break relations with China, for heaven's sake. Join the BRICS. It's a good thing to do. And maybe within the BRICS efforts this year, which are very important efforts to create non-dollar payments, there'll be something in it for Argentina. That I'm going to try to explain to them. There really is some good news for Argentina in the fact that it won't just be the dollar in the world, that there will be alternative payments, and Argentina shouldn't close itself off from what's going to be an important new force in international monetary economics.
That's all very interesting, because one of the things that I noticed, which has not been mentioned, I think, widely, is that Putin, of course, has just been to the UAE and he's just been to the Saudi Arabia, and he came with a very, very big and very strong delegation of people. And I noticed that one of the people who was there was, of course, Nabulina, who is the central bank chair. And both Saudi Arabia,
I didn't realize she was on the trip, but that is a very interesting
it's very
part.
interesting. It was interesting because I don't think it was announced, but there was a list of, you saw the picture of all the people in Riyadh, and they were all shaking hands. And one of the people who was there and who shook the hands was none other than Nabulina. So she was there. And of course, Saudi Arabia and the UAE are both joining the BRICS in a few weeks. So is Iran. The Iranian president has just been to Moscow. He's had discussions there with Putin. There's just been this announcement of this free trade agreement. And then at the same time, Putin gave this speech at an investment forum run by VTB. And a disproportionate amount of that discussion was about the financial architecture. He was saying that, in fact, that seemed to be the most important thing, that, the finance, you need to get the financial architecture right domestically in order to move forward. But he was also talking about the new financial architecture. And he said some very interesting things about how the existing financial architecture, which is Western based, is becoming outdated and obsolescent, also in a technological sense. So you have Nabulina there in all of these meetings, and she's presumably talking about all of these matters. She seems to be very interested in them. And she's talking with the big oil producers. And Iran is also a big oil producer. And at the same time, you have all these discussions from Putin about financial systems. And I wonder whether this adds up.
Yeah, the trip was absolutely fascinating, incredibly skillful of Putin at this moment. And it reflects actually three major geopolitical points, all, I think, rather ingeniously brought together. One of them is OPEC Plus, of course. OPEC plus Russia constitutes an enormous part of the hydrocarbons market of the world, and they do a lot of important business together in this, in managing the oil and gas market. So that's one part of the trip. Another part of the trip is clearly regional, which is the integration of Russia with Central Asia, with the Arabian Peninsula, with the Middle East more generally. And you look at the map, and between Russia, China, Central Asia, Arabia, this is building, and of course, India is a member of the BRICS. This is really building most of Eurasia into an integrated geopolitical and economic huge part of the world. And so very, very deft in that regard also. A basic principle of economics, a fundamental principle is neighbors should get along. They trade well with each other. They share ecosystems with each other. And that's the principle that Putin is following because Iran is a neighbor. The Middle East is a neighbor. This is very smart. And then the third dimension, in addition to the oil and the neighborhood, is, of course, the BRICS. And the BRICS started out as the five: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. It had already reached an output level measured at what we call purchasing power prices or at international prices larger than the G7. That is geopolitically and economically notable. But now the five are being joined by six more, presumably. Argentina, that's the new addition in South America. Egypt and Ethiopia in Africa, and Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and Iran in the Middle East region. Now, you add the six to the original five, you have 37% of world output, according to the IMF purchasing power data, compared to 29 to 30% for the G7. This is a different world, and this is really powerful. And what the BRICS are discussing this year in particular is exactly this financial architecture. And of course, that was greatly hastened by the absolutely awful and mistaken US policies on the dollar. So the US has what Charles de Gaulle, already President de Gaulle, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, called the exorbitant privilege, which is that the dollar is used for about 60% of international transactions of all kinds. The way you denominate a contract, the way you pay to settle a contract, the way governments hold their foreign exchange reserves. So on all three major dimensions of international currency, the dollar predominates. Not exclusively, but overwhelming. And that gives the US a huge advantage. You don't run out of the dollar to what? To the dollar. And so it's not like Argentina where everyone's sitting on the edge as the US debt reaches 100% of GDP. If Argentine debt ever came close to 100% of GDP, they'd be out the door in a moment. But with the US being the currency of the world, nobody flees the dollar. So that's the exorbitant privilege that you get to borrow. You can pump up the money supply. You get some inflation, but you don't get what Argentina or just about any other emerging economy would get. But the US just couldn't leave good enough alone. It had to weaponize the dollar. And this has really been, it's become an addiction. The US generally is addicted to regime change. The US generally is addicted to a foreign policy that says, I don't like you, I want to replace you. Send in the CIA or send in an army, but we get to choose who your government is. Now, this is absolutely disastrous foreign policy, in my view, completely against the UN Charter, completely against international law, but that's the core. And the US figured out 10 or 15 years ago that it could use the dollar as a foreign policy weapon. And the main way that it uses it is in a very crude way, which is to say, one day, your dollars are now our dollars, thank you. Your dollars means literally means you have accounts in US banks or US controlled banks. That's what a dollar is in effect, M2 definition of a dollar. So you're holding dollar accounts in institutions that we control. And what the US has come to do increasingly frequently is freeze the money of other countries, of their central banks, no less, of their state enterprises. And the United States did this with Venezuela. Absolutely absurd, but one day Trump and his minions got the idea that they will declare who's the real president of Venezuela, not the actual president of Venezuela, but they named someone from the Venezuelan parliament as president and said, okay, that guy's president. That actually lasted for a few years. And you could see the power of the United States. It's like the emperor with no clothes. About 40 countries said, oh, now Mr. Guaido is president, not Mr. Maduro, who's actually president. So you could see a measure of the US influence that other countries would follow this nonsense. But in the process, they said, Mr. Maduro's no longer president, because we said so, and he no longer has access to the foreign exchange reserves of the country. We give that to this other one. Well, this is absolutely crazy. Even the IMF couldn't, I shouldn't say even the IMF couldn't figure this out. It doesn't have the gumption to say to the United States, that's ridiculous. So, oh, no, we have a big issue. Who really controls the foreign exchange reserve? So these games went on for years. Of course, with Russia, it's much more serious than that. The United States froze its estimated $300 billion of Russian financial assets. That's a lot of money, by the way. That was the trick that was going to bring Russia to its knees. It didn't do so, but that's what they thought. We've got Putin cornered. We've got Russia cornered. We'll bring them to their knees by freezing their assets and locking them out of the US banking system, the so-called SWIFT settlement system. Well, Russia quickly figured out, very cleverly, we could trade with China and renminbi, we could trade with India and rupees, a little bit shakier on that front. We can find other ways to transact. And to make maybe a short story long as I have, this year Russia is the leader of the BRICS. The BRICS summit will be in Kazan next October, I believe it is. And so Russia chairs the process, and it's chairing an expert group to come up with non-dollar payments. This is smart. And I kept telling my friends in the US government, don't abuse the dollar. It's going to go away. Because in monetary economics, the first thing you teach is the real economy is the real thing, what you produce, what the factories are. There are many ways to make a settlement, even barter, of course, but there are many currencies you can use. So don't think that your currency brings another country to its knees, because the other country's economy is the real economy, the ability to produce steel, the ability to produce weapons or artillery, the ability to produce automobiles or chips or whatever it is, or oil. And the United States misunderstood that, but really abused the privilege of the dollar. And the dollar will absolutely lose its role in centrality in the international payment system in the coming decade. In monetary economics, just to mention, all my colleagues look at history and say it's a long, slow decline of a currency. And the most famous case is the British pound, which used to be the core of the international monetary and financial system in the 19th century until basically the Great Depression. But the fact is, and so they say, look, the pound hung in there even after Germany was larger, even after the United States was larger, even after Britain's share of the world economy had declined. London remained the center of the international system. But it's not going to happen the same way with the dollar, because it's just too easy technologically to do things differently. And so we will have at least an international renminbi at a minimum playing a big role. And we could have a kind of BRICS, if not central bank, a BRICS monetary fund that serves the role of giving liquidity and credits among the BRICS countries in a way which will mean a non-dollar settlement system.
Professor Sachs, just a few things. As a person in Britain, I can say that the long decline of sterling after Britain lost its hegemonic position in the world economy was an absolute disaster for Britain. You would not want to go through that process again.
And by the way, it's quite interesting just to say the way it manifested. Of course, World War I was awful. The return to gold in 1926 overvalued Britain in the world economy. And Keynes wrote one of his most famous essays in 1926 called The Economic Consequences of Mr. Churchill, who happened to be the Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1926 that put this mistake into place. The 1930s were the Great Depression. World War II, of course, devastating. And the point is, by the end of World War II, Britain had basically gone deeply into debt, even with its own colonies, which became independent countries. And so Britain never quite got out of debtor status again. And it was a very, very heavy, long, painful period. Britain, the center of the world, going to the new International Monetary Fund for an emergency loan. I mean, unthinkable. But, the United States, can you imagine going to the IMF for a loan? It's not impossible. This is exactly what you're referring to.
Absolutely. I remember it. I was in London, of course, when it happened. I can remember the Chancellor turning back at the airport, which he had to rush off to Washington to raise funds. And, of course, the fact that we had this currency, which was still an international currency, was doing immense damage to the British domestic economy, which I think people don't understand. So in some ways, it might actually be better for the United States, I would have thought, to go through it quickly than have it, drawn out in the way that it was with Britain. I'm not, by the way, saying that's going to happen, and I'm not making those points. But anyway, that's what I wanted to say. If it's a long process, it's a long agony. It's not based on the British experience.
So, we will have non-dollar payments in the BRICS. That's clearly high on the mind, not only of President Putin, obviously, but also President Lula, who every day asks, and he's the chair of the G20 this year, as well as being a BRICS member, why are we dealing with Russia in dollars, for heaven's sake? And he's very sensible, very logical. And we will move to new payments arrangements, and they will do just fine, thank you. That will be the real lesson. Corruption by the money in the politics. So I would make many changes, but I think the idea should be that sustainable development, that means an economy that works for the common good and that protects the environment and that provides the public services that anyone needs, whether it's health or education, that these are part of the citizens' rights and responsibilities, and that the government has the effective means to carry that out without the corruption of private money in politics is central. And I think, as you say, today's young people are going to really need to fix the U.S. system, because otherwise it's just going to continue to be in decline.
And I think currently another problem with the U.S. is that it's basically Red Scare Volume 2. The counter propaganda against China is like, oh, China is bad to all the young people. So that creates a really unhealthy into their mindset about a prejudice about China and unwilling to learn about these different type of political systems that might have some policies that could be used in the United States.
Excellent point. Basically, there are a lot of lies about a lot of things in politics in the United States, because if you have a system that's based on special interests, the special interests try to hide They want their benefits without saying, you see, I run the government. So we have a set of falsehoods that keep clarity at a distance, actually.
Yeah.
And so it takes some effort, but as you say, the anti-China propaganda is really heavy and very intense right now by people who know nothing about China or its history or its economic successes in the last 40 years or the hard work of the people.
Right. And how do we counter those misinformation?
I think we have first any lies need to be called out. So I try to do that on a daily basis and through articles and books and speeches. But I think it's also important that young people make direct contacts and use the digital connections across schools. So University of Michigan and Tsinghua University working together, discussing and so forth, somehow making such projects both economic, cultural, business, technological, I think would be a big help. But our government is really aiming to, as you say, scare people rather than to really educate them.
Yeah, and the penultimate question is, where do you see the economy, the world economy, in sustainable development ways to achieve in 5 to 10 years?
The good sign is that we have so much new good technology, 5G, low-cost renewable energy, robotics, many new approaches to problem solving. We really could make the energy transformation to safe energy at low cost. And this is the most important point. Use our knowledge and deploy it at scale. But the challenge is conflict, division, vested interests, greed that impedes us from using these solutions at scale. So it's not even possible to predict the future with any insight, because we could have a good future with big solutions, or we could have a very broken, divided, dangerous future, and we have to fight for the good one. And that's why this is more of a question of effort than prediction.
Yeah. So last of all, so what is one message that you will want to share with all the young viewers that are aspiring to be, great economists and entrepreneurs?
Well, go be the best you can, but serve the common good as you do it. Don't lose sight of the fact that we are in an interconnected world. We need global problem solving. We need friendships across nations. All this talk of war and conflict and division is extremely dangerous and completely unnecessary. And so go be champions of sustainable development, use new technologies, be great entrepreneurs, but always do it in a peaceful and cooperative mindset, not doing it because we have to beat the other side, but because it's good for the world. The extent of their consequences can have been seen. And then what's wonderful about Smith in the Scottish Enlightenment is he points out that while this was generally a beneficial fact to unite the world, it was disastrous for the native inhabitants of the East and West Indies, he says, because he says that they were relatively weak at the time. He didn't understand that they also brought pathogens of the old world to the Americas that wiped out the population. So Smith could not have understood that, but he did understand conquest. And he said something incredibly humane at the end, which I think marks him as one of the great thinkers of modern times. He said, hereafter, perhaps, the natives of those countries may grow stronger, or those of Europe may grow weaker, and the inhabitants of all the different quarters of the world may arrive at that equality of courage and force, which by inspiring mutual fear can alone overawe the injustice of independent nations into some sort of respect for the rights of one another. But nothing seems more likely to establish this equality of force than that mutual communication of knowledge and of all sorts of improvements which an extensive commerce from all countries to all countries naturally, or rather necessarily, carries along with it. So what Smith is saying is, in the future, there's going to come an equality because trade is going to carry knowledge, technological improvement, and an equality of force. Basically, we are 250 years after Smith's writing, and that prediction has come true now. So Smith was in the middle of a 500-year period. 500 years ago, Asia in the lead and the center of gravity and in the technological lead. Europe becomes the agent of change. The steam engine, a reflection of that, not something that came out of the blue, but came out of Francis Bacon and Isaac Newton and empire. But it came out of a Glasgow workshop, the condenser on James Watt's steam engine. And there came a new European and North Atlantic-led world. But as Adam Smith said, eventually trade will rebalance, and that's the convergence that we're seeing now. So Watt's steam engine, historians are right to say that what was so fundamental about the steam engine is that it broke the organic barrier of the traditional economy, because basically almost all energy of the primary energy of the pre-James Watt economy was organic. What you could feed to human beings for their labor and what you could feed to the animals for animal traction, plus a little bit of wind and a little bit of water. But basically an organic economy, and we moved to a fossil fuel economy, and that let loose the ability to do work of an unimaginable scale. So everything changed with the fossil fuel breakthrough in the last 2.5 centuries. And of course, Europe got there first, and Britain got there first of the first. And in the geopolitics, we ended up with the British world. This is a map of a wonderful book, The Countries Never Invaded by Britain. Those are the ones in white. Britain went out and just beat the shit out of everybody. And really nasty, by the way. Nasty. In 1839, showed up in China and saying, you have to import our opium. No, we don't want your opium. You don't want our opium? We'll beat the hell out of you. That was the first Opium War. It was followed by the second Opium War. No scruples at all. Sorry to say. So that's power. That's the power of one-sided industrialization. And it conquered much of the world. Long story, and I won't go into it, but the baton was passed to the younger Anglo-American kid brother in 1945, the great Anglo-Saxon handoff, and the US became the next empire. And the idea was that we would dot the world with 800 military bases around the world, and Henry Luce made the sweetest love song to American leaders, telling them this is the American century. That is always captivating. It was captivating to Genghis Khan, it was captivating to Lord Palmerston, and it has been captivating to American leaders since then also, to believe this is your century in the world. It's over, but we still have 800 military bases around the world. I believe the Ukraine war is likely to be America's Teutoburg Forest defeat. Teutoburg Forest was the loss by Augustus Octavian in AD 9, when the Roman Empire tried to cross the Rhine to the east to take over Germania and was defeated. It didn't end the Roman Empire. It just told them, this is a limit, and you're not going beyond that limit. And the United States is going to learn a limit that NATO doesn't just expand at US will. There are limits to that, and that's the painful process that we're in right now. But it's a secret. Don't tell anyone outside. You're likely to be canceled if you do. So The world changed fundamentally after the Second World War. The United States aspired to be the world leader, but something else happened to bring Adam Smith's forecast to reality, and that was the end of the imperial age. If there is one dimension of imperialism that I think needs to be understood, it is that imperial powers do not educate the natives. And if there's one dimension of economic development that needs to be understood, it is that education is the absolute central feature of development. Because without education, nothing else can happen. And so the European imperial powers left the world illiterate, left their colonies basically illiterate. At the end of the colonial rule, the first thing that happened was mass education. We're still not there yet, but this is the most fundamental breakthrough that happened after World War II, the end of the colonial imperial era, and the United States does its empire in a different way through regime change operations, so it's not exactly the same as the occupation imperialism. But what countries got with their sovereignty was the ability to educate their people. And this has led to economic convergence. Just to show you the gaps, the peak of North Atlantic power was 1950 compared to the rest of the world. 56% of the literate world in 1950, roughly by my calculation, was in the North Atlantic region, meaning Western Europe, the United States, and Canada. Now it's 13% of the literate world. 60% of world output was in the North Atlantic region. Now it's 33% at purchasing power prices. 53% of all urban residents were in the North Atlantic world in 1950. Now it's 14%. The world's converged. Urban, literate, technologies have spread. Adam Smith was right that trade was actually the fundamental carrier of this. It was when China opened up that the acceleration of technological change came so fast to China. It was Japan that invented this process of rapid infusion of technology in the Meiji Restoration in 1868, and then again after World War II in its rebuilding. So we now see that Asia and the North Atlantic regions have crossed paths, again, using Madison's data updated by IMF data. The North Atlantic was the dominant power until this gap started to close in 1950. And by around 2010, Asia is now larger than the North Atlantic region. This is the real change of the world. We know that the BRICS, even before the recent expansion to 6 more countries, were already larger than the G7. That's a transformed world. And China, of course, overtook the US in GDP measured at purchasing power parity around 2014. But China is still much poorer per capita, maybe a third, but with more than 4 times the population. So this is the reason that China is a larger economy. So I want to argue very briefly that we're in a new age which I call the age of sustainable development. We're there in part because the scale of economic activity and a population 10 times the size of when Thomas Robert Malthus wrote The Principles of Population in 1798, which was then about 900 million people, and today 8 billion people, now has put so much pressure on the physical environment that we are in urgent need of global public response to climate, biodiversity destruction, loss of ecosystem functions, and so forth. And the world adopted goals addressed to this. It's fitfully trying to achieve them. Today at the UN, this very day, is the midpoint review of the Sustainable Development Goals. They're way off track, nice objectives not being achieved, mainly because the United States and other rich countries don't care at all about it. And so the world governance is not organized to achieve these goals at this point. But these goals are the real global goals and needs. So we have a very perilous moment because we have arrived at multipolarity. And as Adam Smith talked about, that balance of awe and equality of force to create justice, that's a delicate, difficult transformation. And just to say, there are several different theories of what's going on right now. Robert Kagan, whom you may know is our chief neocon ideologue and the husband of our acting Deputy Secretary of State Victoria Nuland, believes that American hegemony must rule and will continue to rule. Otherwise, the jungle will grow back, as he says. Wow. Henry Kissinger says that we need a balance of power theory. Balance of power is okay, except it becomes imbalanced, and it's extremely difficult to manage. And when Bismarck was thrown out by Kaiser Wilhelm II, it was the end of Europe's balance of power, and World War I came in response when Bismarck's genius at balancing was lost. John Mearsheimer says we are inevitably in tragedy. That's just the nature of great power politics. Mearsheimer is extremely intelligent, predictive, an extremely nice person, but tragic to read, because he says that conflict is inevitable. I don't buy it. Now, another theory that I read 50 years ago of a wonderful professor of mine also, Charles Kindleberger, said we need a hegemon. So if it's not the US or Britain, it's got to be someone else like China. I don't buy that either, but this is a brilliant book. Boy, it led to a lot of late night discussions over the next 50 years. Graham Allison says, as with Sparta and Athens, we're prone for war, not inevitable, but the war trigger is very high because of the rise of China. And my little contribution is, could we get our heads together and address global public goods and avoid global public bad? So I argue that we need a rational approach, not a tragic approach, and that it is not beyond us to reach the cooperative corner of the prisoner's dilemma. In other words, we can understand the game, we can understand the risks of defection, but we can understand the benefits of cooperation. And so we should be able to reach that cooperative outcome. So I would argue that we need a new geopolitics and a new ethics of sustainable development. I often refer to President Kennedy's inaugural address when he said, "The world is very different now, for man holds in his mortal hands the power to abolish all forms of human poverty and all forms of human life." So what hangs in the balance is something extraordinary. We could achieve SDG 1, end poverty, or we could blow up the world. And what is absolutely incredible is how this is in the hands of a very few people. That's what's incredible. And by the way, my takeaway from Oppenheimer was, what a bunch of geniuses that invented the bomb, and what a bunch of dolts who use it or decide about using it. This is our paradox. It took the greatest geniuses of the age to understand nuclear fission and how this could be created, and then it fell into the hands of the everyday person who might not have the imagination to keep us away from global disaster. That's technology, by the way. Technology is often created by geniuses and used by all of us. And that is the real issue that Plato was wondering about already in the Republic 2,350 years ago. How do you make the rulers know what to do? He said you have to raise them from birth for that purpose. So there are crucial public goods at regional and global scale. This is something new. Regional scale, like the European Union or ASEAN or African Union, this is something new, how important this scale is. And global scale is almost unprecedented in human history. We had global trade, we had interconnectedness, but global public goods, not so much. Now we are with the center of global public goods, but institutions in the hands of nation states. Why? Weird. So I believe we need new kinds of global governance and ethics, and I think the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a good place to start. We're in the 75th anniversary this year, and I believe that we can even find a common wisdom, which I call the ABCs of ancient wisdom: Aristotle, Buddha, and Confucius. They all, by the way, were virtue ethicists. They basically said, cultivate your soul as decent people. It said it in somewhat different ways, but they said it's virtue that gives us the capacity to reach the cooperative solution, whether it's civic virtue, friendship virtue, or the other virtues of sociality. And Aristotle said it's possible because we are zoon politikon. We are political animals. We can be sociable. And so I think finding this commonality of East and West is crucial now, because there actually is a strong commonality of the underlying cultures. This was already pointed out in the observations of the axial age, that these philosophies arose roughly the same time and with roughly the same philosophical underpinnings. And I'll just end with President Kennedy's remarks 60 years ago. We're at the 60th anniversary of Kennedy's remarkable initiative to make peace at the height of the Cold War and to negotiate the partial nuclear test ban treaty, which was ratified just these days 60 years ago. Kennedy may well have been killed for it, because rogue elements of the US government hated him for his peace initiatives, and I believe that this is probably what did him in. But he made wonderful observations about peace, and I'll just end with his most beautiful words. So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and to the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet, we all breathe the same air, we all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal. Thank you very much. We are in need of this dialogue for two basic reasons that I'd like to elaborate just briefly. One is we are in a new world in these years, and we're trying to navigate a new world. By that I mean the world that we have thought we knew, in some places a rather naive idea, was a Western-led world. And that was an idea that predominated from roughly 1820 to, I would say, the middle of the 20th century. But the notion of Western-led world continued at least until the end of the 20th century. That world is finished, but we don't know it yet. And it's that ignorance of the end of the Western-led world which is at the heart of the very, very serious tensions between the United States and China, for example, because the Western-led world has finished, the United States doesn't know it, and this means that we have a very deep misunderstanding about the nature of our current global reality. The second reason why we are here is that all together we are wrecking the world, the natural environment. So this is a feature of common humanity for a common global commons, which is the title of our meeting. I'd like to say just a few words about how we got here to give you my perspective. For most of the known history of the last 2 millennia, there was no question that Asia was the center of the world economy because it was well over half of the world population. The nature of life pretty much across the world did not vary so widely. So what we would call per capita incomes were similar. People were small farmers in villages, and this was true whether it was in Western Europe, whether it was Native Americans, whether it was in Chinese villages, whether it was in African villages. The population of the world was, from 1 AD onward, enormous in the Indian subcontinent and in China. And this meant that Asia was the center of gravity, if you would make that calculation, of the world economy as well as of the world demography. More than that, China was the dynamic country of the world technology and many civilizational inventions, especially during the Song dynasty from 960 till 1279, till the Mongol conquests. The Song dynasty was a remarkable period of technological fecundity, of economic gain, of multiple fundamental inventions, from the use of the compass for navigation, paper currency, public administration, ocean navigation, movable type printing, and countless other inventions that changed the world fundamentally. So not only was China populous, but China was really dominant. And throughout much of Asia, and especially East Asia, it was China that set the civilizational patterns for what is today's countries of Southeast Asia and Japan and Korea. And this civilization, which was a Neo-Confucian civilization, was a remarkable achievement. At this time, we had the high medieval period in Western Europe, and some breakthroughs were starting, a lot of wars, by the way, and but Europe would have looked to any observer at the time as a taker of technology, a receiver of technology, not as a maker or giver of technology. And the technology came from the East in many directions, from the Arab world, from the Indian subcontinent, from China. There are some notable dates. The worst economic policy mistake in human history was made by China in 1434, when the Ming Dynasty decided to end ocean navigation and to scrap the fleet of Admiral Zheng He. Because China would have discovered the New World, it would have discovered the Americas, it would have created a world economy, but China was concerned, the court was concerned about the incursions from the north, not from the gains of ocean navigation, and the great fleet of Admiral Zheng was ended, and those were the end of the ocean navigations. The oceans were given over to the Europeans, actually. This was really one of the most decisive own goals of human history, I have to say. Now, the next date that's important is 1492, because as China vacated the oceans, Portugal and Spain filled the oceans using Chinese technology, by the way, the ocean navigation and the gunpowder, which all had come from China, to begin an age of navigation. still without the fortuitous fact that heading west from Europe landed a continent that was not known to the Europeans, history would not have changed all that fundamentally. But the Americas became a resource base for Europe's development for the next 4 centuries, which fundamentally changed the world. And Adam Smith, writing in 1776, said that the 2 most significant events in the history of mankind were the discovery of the Americas by Columbus in 1492 and the discovery of the path around the Cape of Good Hope by Vasco da Gama in 1498. So that was a turning point. Still, Asia was dominant, but this little peninsula on the far west of Eurasia began to explore and ironically conquered the Americas, and that was by virtue of pathogens rather than any dominance, because the Europeans brought smallpox, yellow fever, malaria, and many other diseases, and wiped out the Native American populations by around 95%, and were able to conquer, therefore, 2 continents of massive resource base. So history began to change. The next date that I would suggest is fundamental is 1776. That's a very interesting year. 4 things happened that year. You know some of them. The most important was James Watt patented the steam engine in that year. A second decisive event was that Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations. The third decisive event was that Gibbon published The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And then there was something, a Declaration of Independence of some country also. All happened in that year. But the invention of the steam engine was a turning point as significant as 1434 and 1492, because though the steam engine had been invented by China, it had not been utilized by any scale in China. China had invented the steam engine about 700 years earlier. Watt improved the steam engine with a condenser, and Britain became the first industrial country. And this was very significant because in 1839, my next date, Britain invaded China in the First Opium War. The war fought to make the world safe for opium addiction. Really a sordid act, but just an illustration of what had changed fundamentally in power. From China's dominance, now China was in defeat by the British, by a British expeditionary force from not quite halfway around the world, but was able to defeat the Chinese Ming or Qing, Qing Empire. Of course, I won't go into long history, but the defeats in the 2 Opium Wars was followed by the Taiping Rebellion and by probably the worst civil war perhaps in human history in terms of the human toll in the Taiping Rebellion. And China went from being an absolute great power to being a subjected country, and one that faced extreme poverty and hardship later in invasion by many imperial powers along the coast, and then the invasion by Japan starting in 1894, 95, and then in the 20th century. For me, the next turning point is 1947 and 1949, the independence of India and the independence of China. I think there's one key point in history, which is a colonized or imperialized country cannot achieve economic development or success because it is not in the interest of the imperial power to have success in its colonies. The interest of an imperial power is extraction. And so until independence came after this terrible 100 years, China and India were left behind, far behind economic development. So the next turning point in history was the middle of the 20th century when Asia began to recover. And if you look statistically, Asia had been around 60% of world output for 1800 years, roughly, from as much as one can measure this, from 1 AD to roughly 1800 AD. And then by 1950, it had declined to 15%, or perhaps 20% of world output, though the population was still 60%. So the per capita income had collapsed. What we are experiencing now is the recovery of normality, not something outside of human experience, but actually the recovery of normality, because what was abnormal was that a small part of the world, the North Atlantic region, would so dominate the whole world. And that was by virtue of the technological advances, starting with steam engine, and then the militarization of those technologies, which led to a century of imperial domination by Western countries. This would have lasted longer, but the West fought two disastrous, bloody civil wars, World War I and World War II, and by the end of that period, it was, of course, morally, politically, economically, financially, militarily incapable of empire, and with some lagging battles, the countries found their way to independence. So Asia began to recover dramatically fast. And by around 2010, China was larger than the US economy in absolute size, measured in purchasing power terms, but not surprising because China is more than 4 times the US population, or was then. Now it's about 4 times the US population. And so naturally it would become a bigger country. 2 implications, and I'll stop here. One is that now that the whole world is industrializing, and we're going to have development everywhere. India was behind China by about 15 or 20 years, but now India is growing faster than China, is likely to continue to do so. Africa is going to grow faster than both India and China in the next 40 years because it's going to be catching up from farther back. And by the way, Africa right now has the same size population as China and India. All are 1.4 billion. But Africa will be the biggest by mid-century, by far. So if there's an African Union, the African Union will be the most populous part of the world by 2050, by far. And it will be a dynamic part of the world economy also. So we're going to have lots of mindset changes in the years ahead. But there are 2 significant conclusions from this. One is mainly the United States has been shocked at China's rise. And I have to say to my Chinese friends, you didn't ask permission, you know? The US is supposed to be in charge. And now, without US permission, you became so big and powerful, and that is a bit unforgivable in the American mentality. The Americans cannot figure it out because they know no